most important thing to do when teaching a new skill is to make it easy enough so that the learner can contact reinforcement quickly and successfully and often, and then we gradually scale the demands from there. Hello, Ben Schatzel here from Stanham Core Solutions with another Intro to Behaviorism explainer video. Now, today we're going to be exploring a few different topics, but they will be building off of each other, starting with the ABCs of contingency, reinforcement contact, and then prompting. Now, the ABCs of contingency is a framework that allows us to understand every behavior that takes place. But to start, let's set some terms. A is for antecedent. Now, the antecedent is a stimulus or trigger which provokes a behavior to happen. Then we have the behavior, which is that expressed action which has been triggered by the antecedent, and then finally the consequence or the immediate effect or direct result of that behavior. Now today I'm going to be using the example of shoe tying, and we can look at that through this framework. So if a child wants to go outside, perhaps they have a friend that calls them and says, "Hey, let's go to the playground." Then that might serve as an antecedent to the behavior of putting on shoes. That child gets an invitation from their friend. They decide they want to go outside. As a result, they are triggered to put their shoes on and tie them. And the consequence of that is then they are able to freely play outside and enjoy time with their friend. Reinforcement contact. Now, this is a recap from our last video, but let's talk about reinforcement. Reinforcement is a contingency which will always increase the rate of a behavior. Positive reinforcement increases a behavior by adding a stimulus. Negative reinforcement increases a behavior by withdrawing a stimulus. And new behaviors require a lot of reinforcement early on in order to take root. Over time, we can scale those behaviors and scale the demands necessary to achieve reinforcement, and as a result, then those new solidified and scaled behaviors will continue to be expressed more frequently over time. So let's take a look at our shoe tying example. For a child who is just learning to tie their shoes, that might be a highly complex thing for them to learn. They have to put the shoe on their foot, they have to cross the laces, pull them tightly, make the loops. There's a lot that happens, right? Well, for a teacher or a parent who wants to teach their child how to tie their shoes, the best thing that you can do is allow them to contact reinforcement early on. Now, one way to do this might be to tie their shoes for them up until the very last step. And then you have the child simply complete the last step of tying their shoes, and then you reinforce them, either with social praise, or perhaps you give them a hug or some sort of affection. Maybe you give them a little bit of time on the iPod or the iPad. Whatever is going to give that child reinforcement and encourage them to engage in that behavior again. Now, once they've mastered the ability to do the last step of tying their shoes, then you scale that demand, and perhaps you ask them to do the last 2 steps of tying their shoes until they can eventually do it entirely on their own, in which case you only reinforce them for independently tying their shoes. If we don't do that, and we encourage them to completely tie their shoes all on their own from the very beginning, before they've been able to master the sub-elements of it, then that is likely to encourage frustration, and that child is going to assume that it's impossible for them to learn how to tie their shoes because they've never contacted the reinforcement or the good things that are going to encourage them to engage in that behavior again. So that is why reinforcement contact is very important early on when teaching. The most important thing to do when teaching a new skill is to make it easy enough so that the learner can contact reinforcement quickly and successfully and often, and then we gradually scale the demands from there. If they never contact reinforcement, then we might lose their attention as a learner before they ever gain a new skill. Now, prompting and prompt fading. A prompt is a temporary cue to assist the learner. And the reason we use these is to allow the individual to contact the reinforcement. We don't want to complete the task for them, but we just want to nudge them along a little bit so that they can contact the reinforcement, be reinforced for that behavior, and then we will scale those prompts, right? So a couple of notes here is when we scale prompts, we want to provide the least to most invasive prompt possible. And I'll provide an example in just a moment. And once the learner has achieved mastery of that task or skill, then we want to strategically fade those prompts. So let's talk about our shoe tying example. Let's say that the individual has been able to tie their shoes a few times, but they're not fully independent yet. They know the steps, but they have not fully connected their dots in their head to be able to independently do it every single time. What we would do as the teacher is we observe them tying their shoe. If they start to struggle, then we might allow them to independently struggle for a moment or two, and we want to see where their focus is at. Are they continuing to try to figure it out? Are they thinking their way through it? Or are they about to give up? If they are about to give up, then we might provide a subtle prompt, something as simple as a point to the shoelace, or perhaps we pick up that shoelace and hand it to them. If neither of those works, then we might give them a verbal prompt and say, make a loop with the right shoelace and cross it over. But we don't complete the rest of the task for them, we just prompt them through that step. If they get stuck again, then we go up our list of prompts again. If none of those prompts work, then it might be critical that we provide a hand-over-hand prompt. But again, we don't want to do this throughout the entire shoe tying process. We just want to do this for the one step that they are struggling with, because it might remind them how to do the following steps, and they will be able to contact that reinforcement. Now, once they are showing some mastery, then we want to fade those prompts. So if an individual is showing mastery of completing their shoe tying with an occasional verbal prompt, then we want to start limiting those verbal prompts and start using gestures, either a point or a nod. Again, maybe we hold up the shoelace so that they can see it. But what we want to avoid here is something called prompt dependence. And this happens a lot with early learners, where they might complete part of a task, but then they look to the teacher and are waiting for the teacher to provide them the prompt. When you receive that look and that anticipation from the learner expecting something to happen, then you know that that learner has become prompt dependent. They are no longer learning the task. They have associated the learning of the task with your involvement in the task. And this is going to be a roadblock to their independence. All right, so that's it for today's video. A quick review. Remember, we have the ABCs. Antecedent always happens right before a behavior that's being triggered. That behavior will result in a consequence. Perhaps a friend is calling to ask somebody to go play outside. As a result, they engage in the behavior of putting on their shoes, and the consequence is they can safely play outside with their friend. Reinforcement contact. It's very important when teaching new skills to learners that we arrange the demands in a sense that they can contact reinforcement early and often, and then we scale those demands over time. Finally, with prompting, we always want to provide the least invasive prompt and then escalate slightly more invasive as needed to give the learner as little support as they need to complete the task. That way we are encouraging the most amount of independence. And as they show mastery with a certain level of prompting, we want to begin fading those prompts so that they don't become prompt dependent and they are encouraged to become independent and masterful with that skill. That's all for today's video. If you have any topics or ideas which you'd like to explore, let's talk about them in the comments. Also, check out our recent video on the 4 types of contingencies. It's basic information, but you would be shocked how many times people use these terms incorrectly in public. Until next time, you've been watching Spectrum Network from Stand Core Solutions. Take care.